Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar, Micro-Credentials for a Stronger Workforce. My name is Michelle Marsden and I'm the Micro-Credential Manager at Engineering Education Australia. I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to hear from our speakers this morning, Engineers Australia's Chief Engineer, Jane McMaster, and Human Capability Expert and Futurist, Dr. Marcus Bowles. Join us on the panel later in the session. We will welcome Aidan Thompson, Fulton Hogan's Alliance Delivery Manager for Metropolitan Roads Program Alliance. So before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A option in Zoom and we'll endeavour to get to these questions during the panel session. However, if we're unable to get to these questions, we will answer them and we'll circulate back to the group. At the end of the webinar, we'll also invite you to complete a 3-question survey. So please stay tuned for those details. And we'll get started. Okay, acknowledgement to country. Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognises the continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them, their cultures and their elders past and present. Our first speaker today, Jane McMaster, who has worked as an aerospace mechanical and systems design engineer in Australia and internationally, focusing primarily on supersonic flight vehicle design, operations research and rapid prototyping in defence and cybersecurity sectors. She has previously worked as a senior advisor within the strategy unit of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Prior to becoming Chief Engineer at Engineers Australia, she developed a generalised approach for the complex problem solving, which she taught across faculties at universities and to staff from Commonwealth, state and territory government departments. She is also a director on the board of the Australian Council of Professions. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really kind of you. Can I just do a quick audio check? Can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Great, Marcus is nodding. Perfect. All right, well, I'm very excited to be here. Micro-credentials is a relatively new and very exciting space. What I'm going to do, and I'll keep an eye on time, is set the scene a little bit and provide some of the really key insights that we have learned over the last 2.5 years through exploring the engineering workforce. I think we all know it's changing quite rapidly. The pace of change with technology in itself is changing fast, but so is the context in which that is happening. And that has some implications for the engineering workforce, for which micro-credentials can play a really important role. So thanks, Michelle. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Great. So I think by way of very brief introduction, I think many of you on the webinar today will be familiar with Engineers Australia. We are a professional membership association representing the engineering profession in Australia. We represent all disciplines, areas of practice, subdisciplines, sectors of engineering, and we really exist to advance the science and practice of engineering for the benefit of the community. And we do that in a range of ways that I won't list there, but you're welcome to read through. One of the areas is research analysis and thought leadership, and one of our key projects in the last few years has been understanding the supply and demand dynamics of the engineering workforce and what we need to do in partnership with industry and the education sector and government to strengthen the engineering workforce for the future. Thanks, Michelle. So a very brief context. I think we're all aware that while we hear of engineering skills challenges, some people call it a skill shortage, some people call it a labour shortage, and actually there are some nuances to that. But that sits in the context of a broader workforce challenged environment. For a while now, we've effectively been at full employment or near full employment, and we're hearing of skill shortages across most economic sectors. That we may see some of those starting to soften as the economy in general starts to change in its global context, but engineering related employers are still reporting higher than average levels of skill shortages, and our vacancies remain steadily high while we've seen other professions start to drop off over the course of 2023. Thanks, Michelle. So the demand for engineering skills is actually quite hard to put a figure on, but we are certainly seeing it through vacancies data and through all our conversations across the whole profession, across all economic sectors and all areas of the profession. I think, wherever there's technology, there are engineers, and technology pervades most, if not all, aspects of our daily lives. So the demand for engineering skills does exist pretty much across the whole economy. Thanks, Michelle. So anecdotally, we're hearing of acute skill shortages, you might call it, in that non-exhaustive list on the left there, but there are many others. And it's probably no surprise. There are many national priorities at the moment which are technology centric, anything to do with climate change, net zero emissions, energy transition, all our resilient systems and infrastructure, circular economy, biodiversity, everything going on in defense, our huge infrastructure pipeline, the desire to build a sovereign manufacturing capability and strengthening our supply chains, not to mention everything to do with cyber digitization and data, as well as comms, health, housing, education, food and water security with the impending drought, and as well as nurturing and fostering our regions to survive all relies on engineers. So it's probably no surprise to us that our profession is in relatively high demand. Thanks, Michelle. So as I mentioned, so as I said, it's difficult to put a number on future demand, but we think it could be as high as 60,000 additional engineers over the next 10 years. Now you'll see varying estimates. Some people put it as high as 200,000. Infrastructure Australia puts it at 40,000 just for the infrastructure sector alone. Very difficult. We think it's around 60,000 additional to what's in the pipeline already, but there are some nuances to that, and I'll talk through some of those later on. And I think I've already mentioned that engineering vacancies was at a decadal high in May this year, and they're still holding steady. Vacancies in other professions appear to have peaked and falling off as 2023 progresses. Thanks, Michelle. So we've undertaken some work over the last 3 years to understand the supply and demand dynamics and have determined, perhaps not surprisingly, that it's a leaky pipeline. And I'll walk through some of the insights that we've gleaned in trying to understand where those leaks are and what we might do to stem some of the leaks. Thanks, Michelle. Anyone who's been following our work in this space will be aware that we're categorising our two main supply channels into the engineering profession into two supply channels. And the first one is our skilled migrants. Australia has been reliant on our overseas-born engineers for a very long time, well over 10 years. Around 62% of the engineering workforce in Australia were born overseas. And while it's a very important supply channel, it's quite inefficient at the moment. And the reason is that only around half of the skilled migrant engineers in Australia actually are successful in finding engineering work once they arrive in Australia. We've done some research and analysis to understand why, and I think we'll talk through that on the next slide very briefly. So this report from 2021 revealed that there are 7 main barriers as to why our skilled migrants, our overseas-born engineers, typically find it hard to get engineering work. You can see them there, and we have a significant program of work underway to address that. But it's all around providing better support for our overseas-born engineers when they arrive in Australia, to get used to the Australian context, to establish local networks, to find an internship to get their foot in the door, but also to help Australian employers understand what cognitive biases they may be bringing to the recruitment process, and to really open their minds and their internship programs to the possibility of having skilled migrant engineers. We literally have tens of thousands qualified engineers in Australia who are not working as engineers. So there's a bit of an untapped potential there. But that's our first main supply channel, our overseas-born engineers. Now we'll look at the second supply channel. Thank you, Michelle. Which of course is our domestically trained engineers, those engineers that we train at Australian universities and TAFEs. Now, we train the second lowest proportion of engineers in the OECD at just 8% of graduates from universities, following only the USA. So quite a low proportion. Thanks, Michelle. And the number of engineering students is holding steady in absolute terms, but it's declining relative to population growth, and it's certainly declining relative to population and economic growth. Thanks, Michelle. One of the reasons we believe that to be is that there's a smaller pipeline of people who are coming into studying engineering at university. And there are a range of reasons for that, but one of them, I think, is a declining number of students who are choosing to study intermediate and advanced level maths. Now, this is an area that I could talk at length on, so it's going to be quite disciplined of me to only talk about it for 1 minute. The only good news story is that we are reaching gender parity at intermediate level maths, but because maths is no longer mandatory for high school students, and in some universities it's no longer mandatory for engineering students to have studied at that advanced level, we are seeing the declining numbers there. So, and next slide, thanks, Michelle. It's not just the declining numbers that we need to be aware of, it's also arguably our declining performance in maths education. So the OECD runs its program for international student assessment every 3 years, I think it is, for OECD countries around the world. They test 15-year-olds in maths, science, and reading, English, and language. And in terms of Australia's performance in those maths tests, we are declining. So we ranked 10th in 2003 in the OECD and 30th in 2018. The 2021 numbers aren't out yet, but in 2018 we were below the OECD average for the first time. So I think these two charts are beginning to paint a picture that we need to be very much aware of in Australia, and also aware of the implications on the pipeline of young Australians coming in to the engineering profession. Thanks, Michelle. But the engineers that we do train, we train very well. We train them to a very high standard. Australian universities, in terms of engineering education, are great. You may not be aware that engineering graduates have topped the Australian government's employer satisfaction survey for the last 3 years. They're very highly sought after graduates, presumably for their quantitative analysis skills, their problem-solving skills, their design and systems thinking skills. We know that only around 60% of qualified engineers work in engineering roles. There are many qualified engineers out working in other sectors. So the good news is we do train them well. We just don't train enough of them, arguably, to meet our future needs. Thanks, Michelle. There are opportunities to address the leaky pipeline across all levels, including at university. So one of the untapped pools, I think, that we need to spend more time looking at is, of all the people who do choose to study engineering, we actually lose a lot during the university years. We lose a lot after that as well. But we think from the data that only around 25% of engineering students complete a degree in the minimum 4 years. That's for professional engineers. We know that they generally have to work, and anyone who's studied engineering will know it's a fairly heavy workload. So having to work part-time as well is quite demanding. And we know that only around 50 to 60, well, we think the data is a little bit has a few caveats against it, but we think only around between 50 and 60% of people who commence an engineering degree graduate with one. So there's an opportunity there to really understand why people who do have an interest in engineering don't actually follow through and finish with a degree. Are there ways that we can keep them in the engineering family, in the engineering team? Maybe those who started out with a professional engineering degree can transfer across to an engineering associate or technology degree, or can we address the issues which they may be confronted with and help them stay in that qualification? Thanks, Michelle. So there are 3 reports. If you're interested in that super fast summary of some of the key insights, I'd encourage you to jump on our website and look up either the Skilled Migrant Workforce Participation Report, the Women in Engineering Report, which I'm actually going to share 2 more insights on in a minute, and the report that brings everything together, which is our Strengthening the Engineering Workforce in Australia report. Okay, let's have a quick deep dive into the Women in Engineering report. And you might just need to click through a couple of times here. So we've just crunched, thanks, Michelle. We've just crunched the 2021 census data. So these are the updated figures. So we can now say that 16% of qualified engineers in the labour force are women. That's up from 14% in 2016. 14% of the engineering workforce are women. That's qualified engineers working in an engineering role. That's up from 12% in 2016. 76% of qualified engineers who are women in Australia were born overseas. I thought that was very high, and it prompted me to calculate the next statistics, which does surprise many people. This is only about a week old. 3.8% of qualified engineers in Australia who are women were born in Australia, so Australian born women. And that's actually down from 3.9% in 2016, which is not surprising because we're bringing in many more skilled migrants. But it's quite a small proportion. So I think it really indicates that there's more work to do to inspire more young Australian girls to study engineering and choose engineering as a career. We've known that for a long while, but the data really, really supports that. There's good news on the horizon. 19% of engineering graduates in 2021 were women and 20% of enrolments, and that's going up. So there's a bit of a lag in the system. But in our research, the one insight that I find very powerful is that when we interviewed hundreds of women who chose engineering and hundreds of women who didn't, and 90% of the women who didn't choose engineering either never considered engineering or barely considered it. And the most common reason cited for not choosing engineering was a lack of awareness of what engineering is and what engineers do. So that is a huge opportunity for us. That is what we need to focus on as a profession. Thanks, Michelle. Michelle, you can click through this one. I'm not going to talk through this in detail. You're welcome to have the slides after this. Thank you. But what it really is a summary of that pipeline of our engineering workforce and the key areas, the 15 key objectives across that whole pipeline that I think that we need to focus on. And you'll see that there are some key objectives in the school years. There are some key objectives in the engineering education years. There are some really important things that we need to focus on in the workforce years, retaining our engineers in the workforce, skilled migrants, we've already spent a little bit of time talking about. Women in engineering is absolutely something we cannot take our eye off the ball on. And of course, we also need to be thinking about how we plan for our future workforce and send those demand signals back to schools and university. And how do we think about the productivity of the engineering team? How can we think about the full engineering team from tradespeople, engineering associates, engineering technologists, and professional engineers? How can we use those members, draw on those members and improve their productivity individually and collectively? Thanks, Michelle. So a quick few remarks on professional standards, and we'll get to why that's important and the important role of micro-credentials. So I think many of you will know that Engineers Australia is the Australian signatory to the International Engineering Alliance, and our standards that we set nationally, both for engineering education through the accreditation program and for our independent practice credentials, so registration, statutory registration, and the charter credential, are all aligned with the international standards. And that's really important for mobility. So people from other countries can come and work in Australia easily as engineers and vice versa. So that those standards are very important because the community currently trusts the engineering profession, high levels of trust and confidence. And of course, we want to maintain that level of trust and confidence. Engineers do important work that have serious implications for public and worker health and safety, and we need to maintain the standards of our work. So that's why professional standards are important. Thanks, Michelle. And so I just want to sort of jump down to the bottom of this slide a little bit. Historically, EA has done a lot of work on standards at the international level and then at the competency standards level, engineering education and independent practice. Where the future is pointing us to is an equal focus on what comes next, what comes after independent practice. And I think this is where the micro-credentials start to play a really important role. The profession's changing, the skill sets that engineers need are changing and expanding, and we don't have time to go back to uni to redo 2, 3, 4-year degrees. So micro-credentials is going to be a vital way that we uphold standards for our profession as our profession evolves. We've been doing a lot of work in areas of practice, both in developing new areas of practice to reflect the evolving profession. So, for example, we're looking at introducing cyber, clean energy, software, and a number of other areas of practice. But really what's important about that as well is that it's not just in name only. So we're developing competency frameworks for these areas of practice, and we want to go back to our existing areas of practice and develop competency frameworks for those as well, so that there are standards at a more granular level than we've had before. And I think that might be a useful framework in which microcredentials can be situated. Thanks, Michelle. So my final slide is just to share a few reflections that I am seeing in my conversations in a range of engineering organisations across all sectors. And these are in addition to stopping the leaky pipeline. There are some very important things from that slide earlier that we need to do, but I do think that reskilling and upskilling will continue to be a significant challenge for our workforce as the pace of change in technology and more generally continues to increase. So some of the trends I'm seeing are that the engineering workforce are after experienced engineers. I think they understand that the only way you're going to get experienced engineers is to bring on graduates and provide internships and grad programs, but they're crying out for people who know what they're doing. And so it's really important to provide our engineering workforce with opportunities to learn, and that includes experiential learning opportunities and learning opportunities that microcredentials might provide. We're also hearing, perhaps not surprisingly, that T-shaped engineers are needed more than ever. So they need that deep subject matter expertise and skill set, but they also need to be able to work in those multidisciplinary teams and have communication skills and critical thinking skills and problem solving skills, and be able to translate engineering ideas into those teams which comprise people who aren't engineers. We also need to upskill and reskill to ensure that the transition, the clean energy transition, is a just transition and ensure that people maintain their jobs. But that's also an opportunity. How do we keep those skilled workers in the workforce? They've got valuable skills, they just need to be tweaked or additional context is given. There's a sense of urgency. We don't have time on many of the challenges that we're facing, especially around climate change and energy transition. We don't have time to allow these skills to develop necessarily organically. So microcredentials can arguably play a role in establishing high quality, consistent set of skills to our workforce. The other thing I'm seeing is a rise in complexity, and the more complexity in systems inherently in themselves and the more they're integrated, the more we're going to need systems engineering skills in our engineering teams. Trust in the engineering profession is vital, and that goes hand in hand with our ability to communicate engineering ideas and concepts and value in economic and societal terms. And finally, retention in the engineering workforce. I think skill building is an incentive to stay, both in an organisation and a profession. And I'm hearing from many engineering organisations that churn in the workforce is a significant concern. I spoke to one chief engineer from industry fairly recently. He was concerned that 44% of his engineering workforce had been recruited in the last 18 months. And that provides a workforce who's relatively new to the very complex engineering that they're doing. So retention of our engineers is really important. So I hope I'll leave it there. I hope that provides some useful context for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating deeper dive into the world of microcredentials from Marcus. And I look forward to any questions later in the panel discussion. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Jane. And what some great insights there to the challenges and the skill and labour shortages in the engineering sector in Australia and more broadly as well. And looking forward to hearing as well, how standards and microcredentials can actually help solve those problems. So I'll now introduce Dr. Marcus Bowles. Marcus is the Chair Institute of Working Futures. A recent addition to the Capability Co group, holds an honorary professor, and this is really hard, honorary professor positions at universities in Australia with over 300 corporate engagements, 25 years both nationally and internationally. Marcus has got a proven track record of deep expertise in researching the future shape of work, careers, and the required abilities. He also works to develop more effective system-level approaches to capability building, strategic workforce planning, and the design and delivery of innovative lifelong learning, assessment, and international credentialing systems. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Michelle, for reading all of that when I said, probably just summarise it. I solve problems for organisations looking at tricky and complex issues. I'll take a different type of speed now. Thanks for that, Michelle. In terms of Jane, thank you very much for setting up the background. I just want to get into under the hood of what we're doing. I work from large corporations to small businesses. I work across all industries, Australia and internationally, and obviously as chair of Institute for Working Futures, but particularly with the work that we've been doing now as part of Capability Co Group. We're about accelerating workforce development. I can make a grandiose statement. I've said it every year for the last 3 years, and I'll probably say it for the next 5 or 10. This year and the next 5 years are going to be the most profound changes in workforce that we've seen in Australia. Not only the most significant changes in terms of what's happening with technology, the fact that our skills and careering structures have basically been completely rebooted, and we're still trying to serve and deliver students and graduates and a new workforce using old technology and old models. So let's roll it on, Michelle. There's 4 key areas. We all know about them. We all affect them. But let me give some real context to this. In the sense of what we're looking at, if we're going to take just some numbers, because you've got to throw some numbers at this, because I understand there's lots of engineers and you love numbers as much as I do sometimes. In the next 5 years, we've got 15% of our workforce will actually be in roles that exit the whole labour market. So think about that in pre-COVID times. Every 5 years of census, we turned over about 5% of roles where they became redundant. The old, printer typesetters and the photographic people that used to do all the development, all those sorts of roles that go out of the economy. But the reality is that we're now up around 15%. We're tripling the pace that exits from the labour market. The upside is we're creating 20% new roles. We're losing 15% and creating 20%. Now, if we're looking at that in terms of what we're talking about in terms of graduates, over the next 5 years, we need 2.4 million new graduates for the roles that don't exist, that no educational institution is currently delivering courses for. 2.4 million over the next 5 years. Anyone works in universities or with universities? A university responding to that demand and turning it around in 5 years? We're seeing some fundamental shifts that the existing systems aren't keeping up with. So the supply is diminishing. The concept of a job and what it looks like has changed significantly. They're not going to be the classification that our education system, ABS and everything else points at. We're creating jobs which mesh together roles from across different functions. We have different ways of doing business. The most important thing to understand is when we're doing that business, that what we're doing now is actually moving people between careers that are in totally different industries more often than we ever have before. So if you're looking at the numbers again, typically we used to change jobs 3 times within a career back 20 years ago. Then we used to change careers 3 times about 4 years ago. Now we actually expect someone over the life of their actual working life to change their careers across industries at least 10 times. Across industries. Okay, let's move to the next one, Michelle. First thing to really understand is that we no longer have this neat little vertical where we have all our job families and job architectures. I know we love those structures, particularly are we working across organisations like the John Holland and the Telstras and the people doing all the power generation, the mining, the Fortescues, all the rest of it. The legacy of those old systems is a very steep hierarchy in a stable market where a person came in and went up this nice little ladder until they progressed to become the CSO, staying within their swimming lane of a profession or a discipline. Forget that model. That model is going to be the smallest part of how careers are going to be within the next 5 years. Right now, that's about 50% of people in the economy. In the future, we're talking about people moving across different functional areas. Their job role, for instance, even if they're in the company right now, may mean they're in an agile and they're going to be in missions and teams and squads who are working on different functional problems across different parts of the organization. Concept of having a really clear structure and a hierarchy with a flatter organization, with more mobile workforce, with more diverse interests that are occurring and the opportunity to be more flexible, means careering is going to be more multi-directional. Michelle? Okay, so I'm going to make some observations intentionally provocative, and I'll hurry through this so we've got some time for questions. We need to prepare people for careers, not just for a job within a profession or a vertical. Profession that thinks professionals stay within a vertical that's called the engineering industry, in actual fact, is not prepared for how that workforce will be encompassed in the future. In fact, I can tell you directly, working with other professions, we work across 5 of the leading professions, the largest ones in Australia, and they're all preparing for a workforce that in actual fact will be distributed across many different functional areas. So we need to actually cater for members who need to see a career where their profession is an anchor for them to be able to continually come back to, but grow across multiple different functional or traditional industry boundaries. Thanks, Michelle. The T-shaped career. We talked about it, we know about it, but let's just be really clear about what we're doing when we're building capability architectures rather than job architectures. If you haven't heard about it, then the big push at the moment coming particularly out of the US vendors in the talent systems is all about skill organization, a skills-based organization. We recruit for skills, not for credentials. We build a structure not around the job families and the job hierarchy that we used to have, but around the skill clusters we need to get the job done. They've got it half right. If they actually looked at the rest of the world, the US would actually understand that that's only half the model. We've been moving ahead even further than that, and we talk about capabilities, where we're talking about the abilities that not only are technical, but also are human. Now, the human ones are essential because they're the top of the T. When we talk about building an organization for the future, we want as many people as possible to be able to collaborate, problem solve, all the things Jane was talking about on the things that relate to, if you like, the whole of workforce. Now, that might be in, say, in ANZ, only 5 core capabilities. In Telstra, it's 7. We know from our research over 30 years in the human capabilities, there's about 13 that cover about 80% of all our future job descriptions. If you can get those right, that's where your adaptive capacity comes from as an organization. As an individual, it's all the things that allow you to move across those functional streams. When we look down the channel, then we start to see things that are common to many roles or many functions, such as leadership. We're also seeing things like risk management, design, all the things that engineers are really strong at. And then if we go down the functional area as well, we start to see, if you like, functions, but if you think in engineering terms, areas of practice. Those areas of practice are going to be more related to the functional role and a job. So they're likely to be competencies or skills. They are the things that make you able to do the things that need to hold up the rest of the organization in your functional area. Let's move on, Michelle. But if you're talking about the roles and what people get paid for and where people will earn more money, it's across the top of the T. It's the human abilities. As technology gets more dense and is affecting us with AI and all the automation, which everyone's making big noises about, but I think if anyone was reading anything, they'd know 10 years ago that this was going to happen. It's the human factors, the human abilities that actually make us more robot-proof. It gives us a more future-proof career because we're able to move between things, between jobs, between roles, between different functions, to collaborate with people across different boundaries, to be able to orientate and design innovation and together the execution of the AI and the technology. We actually need more human abilities. Thanks, Michelle. And we're paying for it as employers. So when we're building that lifelong careering idea, we also need to not only look at the whole idea about the fact that we're looking at technical, but also the human abilities. When we're working with companies to attract and retain talent, the day they walk in, we're actually showing them an ability to be personally developed up a career ladder that starts to match not only their professional journey, but also has to match their salary journey and their opportunity journey. So we are starting to build academies in organizations where we're using micro-credentials, which I deliberately haven't talked about yet, but I will come to that. So we're creating an employee value proposition which says, come to us because we know where we can take you, and also stay with us because you'll go on a journey where you'll actually get professional recognition, you'll get career progression, really rapidly, and you'll start to realize the value of your innate and your professional skills at the same time. So we're actually building academies with micro-credentials with universities that automatically recognize and give credit in qualifications across every stage of that journey. Please flip the next one, Michelle. So we're building professional journeys, and particularly for engineers who are so valuable across multiple functions, across multiple streams. We're building it for both what they can do and, more importantly, for how they behave, how well they fit our culture, how well they respond and adapt to our future journey. In one particular organisation, which I'd love to name, but I won't because obviously there's a few people that might pass it on, we actually found that there were areas where people were meeting all of their performance needs in engineering areas. But those engineering areas, those senior managers who'd been there for 20 years, predominantly male, predominantly doing incredibly well with what they were doing technically, were also the highest attrition areas for all new engineers and new technical people coming into those work areas, because they were really low on human capabilities. They were really low on developing, innovating, giving personal regard to those individuals and their development journey. How long can you continue as an employer to have people who perform very well technically, but actually cost you all the young people coming into the workforce and not delivering on the culture that you're trying to build to adapt to that future that we know every organization has to move towards at one stage and at some stage in the future. Thanks, Michelle. And we'll just flick through these slides. I think that one says enough. We are moving to a skills-based hiring and talent system in employers. Credentials, particularly degrees, are a very poor signal for most of the workforce in terms of our hiring, recruitment and retention. In engineering, they are a really good indicator, but there's too few of those people coming out to actually fill the need. So we're using digital credentials. A micro-credential is basically a component of a macro-credential, which is a qualification. So a digital credential can recognize anything, but a micro-credential is basically being used by employers to underpin our efforts to signal someone is actually employable. They can do what they're supposed to be able to do in the real world. And they are not only able to do it today, they have the potential to repeat and to grow into the future. Thanks, Michelle. So when we're looking at this, there's a lot of things where we're already seeing a landscape emerging across the globe where digital credentials are now part of all their efforts to build a future workforce. In Australia, with the work that we're doing with human capabilities, and we've been doing that over the last 20 years, and in particular with micro-credentials over the last 10 years, we already have the universities that are actually backing all of the human capabilities at every level. Every human capability across 7 levels, across 13 variations, if it's executed and implemented with our corporate clients with their own variations, will automatically trigger a micro-credential that will carry credit into a course with at least 8 universities. We're recognizing learning that's occurring in the flow of work. We're recognizing informal and non-formal learning, but it has to be against a standard that is recognized very broadly by the industry, particularly employers, as a trustworthy indicator of employability at a level for that capability. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, should never quote yourself. You can read that later and there's a pack will be available. But basically what we're doing is that we're actually using the credentialing to formally acknowledge when someone's attained skills, knowledge and experience that relates to an applied professional standard of practice, a level of proficiency. The best people to judge this aren't the universities. The best people to judge this, if you're talking about trust in the community, particularly employers, is the professional body. Thanks, Michelle. Again, lots of really good UBUT numbers. Micro-credentialing in Australia has been convoluted and confused by the belief that it's actually universities that do micro-credentialing or TAFE colleges. It absolutely is not about learning. It absolutely is about employability and the talent cycle. The more that we have a conversation around these areas from universities in Australia, and it's overwhelming and so noisy, and it's actually starting to get into the language used by government, unfortunately, then we're actually hiding the fact that 85% of global micro-credentials are issued by employers, vendors, or professional bodies, not educational providers. Not educational providers. They are in most cases in a relationship with the professional body or the employer to provide the educational pathway to the full macro credential, the qualification. But we're specifically targeting micro-credentials to huge talent needs. Thanks, Michelle. So trust in a qualification as a signal of employability is diminishing. There's one for you. The existing qualification approaches, the big chunky approaches that we're using, particularly for graduates, is too big, too slow, and too non-responsive to the needs of current employment conditions and the emerging areas in particular. And so if you think employers are going to sit around and wait to find the right talent out there in the very rare and scarce talent environment, not happening. We're building micro-credentialing models for roles that don't even exist yet. We're building them in HV, in high voltage electricity, in some of the renewable areas where we aren't even talking about what they are yet. For mining clients, for some of the telecommunication companies, we're building roles and we're attaching capabilities to them and already building the micro-credential models and then going back to the universities to give them a market signal about where they need to start moving. And in the absence of that signal, giving us credits into the existing courses. And in some cases, we're building courses with up to half a master's degree, fully established for the university, even knows that's a market they should be servicing. So we can get the relationships with universities prior to them actually realizing the full need. Thanks, Michelle. I'll just do a couple more things about micro-credentials and why they're important. A lot of what we do in qualifications doesn't recognize what I talked about earlier. If you went to, and I have been a director of a centre and an MBA program and a professor and done all of those things and still hold all the professorial appointments for the research that I do, blah, blah. We hate as academics having something in an individual that we can't change in the course of running a program. And that means our deep mindsets and our behavioral attributes that are built into our personality. They are the most important things when we're recruiting, though. And so we use the psychometric and ability tests, particularly new ones that we've been developing, where we can actually now predict with much more reasonable grounds potential of someone to be higher over and above their qualification, prior experience, or their current job. We can identify where they could be better and where they might flourish but not know it. And that's really important because a lot of the talent that exists in organizations is actually in the wrong job stream or in an area they didn't know where they had a more or a better matching opportunity. So a lot of the latent talent we have, we're moving high demand, high growth areas from inside the existing organization. Thanks, Michelle. And because I've been called a futurist for this particular presentation, and I haven't been called that since the 90s and try to avoid it as much as possible, I thought I'd better throw in something that's very future looking before we get some more questions. The ecosystem of skilling and hiring and talent has changed. If you are working in finance areas or you're working in areas where you need the tickets like the yellow card, green card, or for the transport and the rail, where we've got engineering areas where you can't literally go and do things unless you are digitally scanned in to be able to be on site to do those things. Think about that as a global system where we're creating digital wallets where you're going to have shareable, securable, personally controlled identity and credentials that you hold to be able to do things. In this ecosystem, two things really matter. It's got to be digital and across a global space, and it's got to be trustworthy before it goes onto that system. In this system, this is where professional bodies play an absolutely critical role about making sure that the workforce that's been hired, but also the workforce that's been deployed, has the professional practices and, importantly, professional codes of conduct and behavior be able to do what the employers are looking for and they're actually paying that person to do. This system is global. We're already setting up and working with it against international standards. And we're already doing this right now in Australia with a couple of clients. And the banks are already doing it in very large scale with identity on other areas of operation. So this isn't over the horizon. This is right now, but very few people realize if you're not moving in this system, unfortunately, the education systems are looking at qualifications as big chunky things. We're looking at it right down to the 3 or 4 things we want that person to have, and can they show us they can actually do that? Thanks, Michelle. One final last slide. So, point I made earlier, that we're using credentials for 2 reasons. Individuals want to be employed for their maximum value and for where they're going to flourish in a career. Could be social, could be environmental. It could be that they actually want to go for the people that are going to pay them the most and be able to be discovered and matched against the talent demand, where they're then going to be developed along that future career. Micro-credentials are the currency we're using to build out the fact that individuals are more employable, we can find them better, and we can match them better to our needs for a particular role, but especially for their potential to move into other roles in future. So what I've done here is try to lift our vision of what micro-credentials are and the problems we're trying to solve with them now, and cast back on what Jane has said about the fact that professions play a critical role in Engineers Australia because of its coverage of engineers that cover so many of the functional areas and can play such an important role across the top of the T, will be a vital player in this space into the future. Thanks, Michelle. That's it.
Thanks, Marcus. And thank you, everyone. I'm just going to bring everyone back in for the panel session. Okay, thank you, Marcus. Observation 4 was really interesting. I think that really underpins how micro-credentials and standards are really going to help us going forward, looking at solving those skill solutions, or skill problems, sorry. Okay, so before we get started on the questions, I'd like to introduce Aidan to the panel. Aidan is a chartered engineer with almost 25 years postgraduate experience working on diverse and complex civil engineering projects, including airports, major roads, rail, pavement, precast and structural projects. Currently employed by Fulton Hogan as the Alliance Delivery Manager for the Metropolitan Roads Program Alliance, removing dangerous level crossings in Greater Melbourne metropolitan area. Aidan has the ability and commitment to manage and deliver projects safely, on time and to the highest standards. Aidan keenly pursues professional development opportunities, and through the combination of mentoring, formal and informal training opportunities and lessons learnt assessment, strives to continually improve his working environment. Aidan has a passion for knowledge sharing within industry and is active in learning and development opportunities, including community of practice, where like-minded individuals gather, discuss and learn practical aspects of construction works whilst improving their profession. So welcome. Okay, so let's kick off. I've got a question for Jane. It really talks around the standards in which we're talking about, and it's, so what does Engineers Australia have in the way of professional industry standards available to the engineering profession currently?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. So in the last few years, we've been working on micro-credentials with aligned standards in our stage 2 competency standards space in the areas of ethics, risk, stakeholder engagement and communication. We've also been doing some work with industries to shape standards of practice for particular industries, and we've kicked that work off with the construction engineering area of practice learning and development guide. We did that in partnership with the ACA, the Australian Constructors Association. We're also developing micro-credentials and aligned with and the standards to which that will be aligned on rail signalling, track and signalling engineers, in conjunction with the Australian Rail Association. And then there's a whole host of future plans as well. The future areas of practice that we're looking at are nuclear engineering, cyber, software, hydrogen, clean energy, manufacturing, maritime, transport, rail, water, potentially safety engineering, and we're currently looking at a specialisation and the associated competencies and standards for dam engineering. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the spectrum of fields of practice that we're looking at developing competency frameworks and standards, and ultimately micro-credentials for. And we tend to do that in partnership with other professional and industry bodies, and also sometimes in partnership with industry.
Well, it sounds like a huge amount of work to come. And so for yourself, from an industry perspective, how important is a professional industry standard for yourself?
Yeah, look, so it's vitally important. And I guess Jane's already covered a lot of this in her presentation. But in summary, it enables us as a profession to build trust amongst the stakeholders in the community within which we work. So it's providing a framework for engineers to practice not only ethically but competently and responsibly as well. So as individual engineers, we're all representing our companies and the profession to those people who are engaging or hiring us, so that they can be confident that they're going to get or obtain sound solutions to their problems. So yeah, as engineers, we're interpreting, quite often very complex situations or arrangements, and to have that framework, it certainly makes sure that we're delivering those outcomes appropriately.
And keeps it consistent across different sectors as well, I would assume.
Certainly, yes, that's absolutely correct.
So Marcus, the next one's for you. So what are the benefits of an industry standard? Why are they so important when aligning micro-credentials?
Because it's a standard that's actually, first of all, it needs to be a standard. It needs to be written as a standard. You need to understand that there's different types of standards in terms of how they apply. So you might have competency standards that are and skill standards that are really related to the functional or the areas. But there's also standards relating to behaviour and codes of conduct that go across the top of the T. Those standards, when it's done by a profession, are actually considered more trustworthy if that standard is what we're credentialing against. So we're collecting the evidence for actual performance, and not just learning that says they might be able to do that, but the learning is scaffolding and leading to the application. That's when we're credentialing. And the difference between giving a credential that's part of a qualification or a competency-based system that's related to a job performance, a profession has much more portability and much more transferability when we're talking about enduring capabilities and trying to build that future workforce.
Right, thank you. And Jane, I've just realised you've answered my next question, which was what do we have on the horizon? So, that's I know we've got a large piece of work there, and I think we've got quite a roadmap ahead of us in the next couple of years to do those things that are on that roadmap. So for Aidan, yourself, how will micro-credentials support yourself and your organisation filling the skills for your future workforce?
Yeah, and again, so some of this has already been discussed by Marcus and Jane, but I guess the micro-credentials is that targeted skills development, so they can focus on a particular need of either the industry or the business, compared to a gap in the competency of those engineers. I guess they provide a very easily accessible, so they can either be done part-time or online, and so it is that very viable option. I think the other benefit is they can be really tailored as well. So where I work on MRPA with Fulton Hogan at the moment, so we recently ran one of the Emerging Engineers Leadership Programs, which included 2 micro-credentials on risk management and also ethical practice. But all of that, we were able to work with Engineers Australia and tailor that to our specific processes, procedures, values as well, so that not only were we making sure that the core sort of information was being conveyed from an industry perspective, but we could also hone right into how we, the nuances of what we expect as a business, and how we actually ensure that compliance within our area as well. I think the other real key thing, again, as has been discussed, so rather than them just attending, this continual professional development and getting an attendance certificate, there is the assessment. So we know that the people are actually gaining that area of expertise. They have a thorough understanding, and we know that, again, with continued support, they can actually go and practice those newfound skills, bridging that gap in a very competent sort of way.
Right, thank you. Thank you. And I guess, Marcus, so we had a look a little bit of the wallet in which we're using for, I suppose, the future access of all of our skills and what we will carry with us. But for you, what does the future of microcredential look like from a global perspective?
Yeah, I think again, it's probably one of those areas like Jane on the topic. If I was to talk about it, how can I do it in 1 minute? I think the biggest thing to understand is what we understand today is not the model of the future. So the idea that, for instance, universities are regulated and we have the whole skill supply regulated very much on a national basis will go once we start to see courses and professions moving across international boundaries. We see that now. But most people don't realise that, for instance, 3 of our largest employers in Australia are outside the retail sector. In actual fact, have around about 20 to 30% of their workforces providing contract services in countries other than Australia. We're building micro-credential models that work in their country as well as here. We're building careering pathways that work across functions irrespective of location. So I think the biggest thing that we need to understand, the reason we're moving to a digital wallet is not only the trust factor, it's the mobility and the portability of that credential across global occupations, locations, jurisdictions, and other things. That's why the professional certification as well is really important, because it doesn't just say what a person can do to a standard, it says where they can actually do it, and importantly, how they do that. So there are regulations and there obviously are restrictions on sites and other areas. And at the moment, how you police that and how you manage that on a global basis, that's really an interesting one. And how you do it once AI starts to work into the equation and we're starting to see parts of jobs being performed by AI and the other part completed by a human. At what point is that actually a capability that we can regulate and can actually follow and manage? There's lots of questions around it, but credentialing and a much tighter, more discrete understanding of that beyond the bigger qualifications, particularly, as I said, post the graduate, I think is a very important area for conversation.
Thank you. And I might actually go, so that was the questions that we had prepared for the panel. So I'm just going to go to one of the questions that I found here before, which I thought was really interesting, Jane. That sort of goes back to the to part of your presentation, which was around STEM and STEM in, getting people into STEM, children to STEM. And it was saying that having some stage 1 competencies in a micro-credential actually led to a person taking that up in school as an education pathway. I guess, can you see micro-credentials in the future helping to bridge that gap between people from high schools into university, into doing the extracurricular, perhaps, micro-credential for engineering?
Oh, look, that's a really interesting idea. And I certainly think there's a very live conversation underway at the moment about what we refer to as alternative pathways to engineering. I certainly think the traditional conventional models of engineering education are being challenged, and Engineers Australia is all for innovation around engineering education, absolutely, not at the expense of standards, because of the important role engineering work plays in our society and communities. But we are already seeing some really interesting models based on higher apprenticeships for professional engineering qualifications. So still 4 or perhaps 5-year qualifications, but with a real mix of modular-based learning, integrated with work integrated learning in a workplace. And those sort of relatively new models are consistent with the engineering education standards that we uphold. So there's lots of really interesting ways in terms of how we use micro-credentials to encourage our younger Australians. Wouldn't that be a fabulous thing to do? I can absolutely see that there's a role there. We'd have to do the work to understand how that progresses into uni credits, if that's what you're suggesting. But I certainly think our STEM outreach in schools, we've got hundreds of them in Australia, hundreds of government-sponsored initiatives, hundreds of non-government-sponsored initiatives, and they're great, but they don't seem to be quite enough, because while the dial is moving, especially with women in STEM, it's not moving fast enough. So how can we build on what we're already doing and tweak it so that it's more effective and that we are inspiring more young Australians about STEM careers? I think it's a really interesting idea, Michelle.
Right. Well, we're over 1 minute over time. Thank you so very much, everyone, for attending today, and thank you very much to our panelists, Marcus, Aidan, and Jane. It was really insightful today, and I really enjoyed it from a personal perspective. Researching in this area, that it was really interesting, and hopefully all of our participants actually got some amazing insights into this area of what we're looking for. So what we've got in the chat also, we've got a survey, there's a link there, there's a code. There's only 3 questions. We'd really love to hear back from you, from the participants. So yes, I'll finish off now and say thank you so very much, everyone. It was really great to have you on board today. Thank you.